Hello again. Thank you all for sticking around for this panel with esteemed experts on space sustainability. Before we get started, I have a 1-minute commercial for a product Secure World put together. If you were here last year, then you saw it, but hey, you get to see it again. Secure World put together a handbook for new actors in space with the idea that we would put together kind of a welcome to the club, so you want to launch a satellite sort of handbook. It has 3 parts. It goes into the international legal regime. It talks about national regulatory and oversight rules that are needed, and then finally goes into best practices for on-orbit operations. It's free. It's on our website as a PDF. I have hard copies. Whoa. I have hard copies that I hope will knock the microphone off with. Hard copies outside. If you'd like to grab a copy, come see me, and hopefully it'll help with the sustainable use of space as well. And with that, I will let our speakers go. I think we'll go in the order of what's on the agenda. So that'll be Dr. Kazuto Suzuki, starting off first, please.
Right, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for ORF, Raji, and other sponsors, including Secure World Foundation, UNIDIR, and the others for thanking. I would like to thank for inviting me for this very important and interesting workshop. I think in the previous session and previous keynote speech, we were talking about adding up the capabilities, but I think this session is all about how to manage the capacity. And what I like to explain here is that I like to show you the recent reports that is published from the Japanese government about the issue of the continuity of the services and the mission assurance. So this is both applicable to the defense space assets, but also the civilian space assets, because I think because of the nature of the dual use in space, it is extremely important to make sure that we would ensure the continuity of the services for not only the defense assets, but also the civilian assets. And it is also very difficult to deter other countries to intentionally attacking those space assets, but also there are risks of the non-intentional collisions with debris and the other issues, including solar flares. So we need to think about the continuity and make sure that our capability is our capacity of providing services has to be maintained, and therefore we need to be prepared, not just talking about adding up this capabilities, but also I think it is extremely important in a very congested and contested and competitive environment in space to provide that to be prepared for that issue. And I think this is quite applicable for the Indian situation, because Japan and India are both spacefaring nation with the extensive amount of the use of space for the civilian purposes. And I think the idea of continuous services for the civilian purposes, for the socio-economic objectives, is also as important as maintaining the capability of the defense applications. So the whole concept of the continuity of the mission is called the mission assurance. The mission assurance is about to secure the continuity and the stability of the capacity of achieving the objective of the space systems by identifying and avoiding the risks and improving the resilience and recovering from the losses of those services. The United States has initiated this definition and the discussion about the mission insurance, but this is more or less focused on the defense mission capabilities. But in Japan, since we have a very small application in the defense application in space, and therefore this concept is applied to the civilian asset as well. So this is the image of the how to recover from the loss of the services. One is to to increase the capacity so that we would avoid losing the entire capacity, or we just shorten the time of the loss so that we would be able to continue our services, and the shorter is the better. So in terms of the idea, we focus on the five principles. One is that those recovery aspect has to be cost effective, and it has to be based on the future prediction. So strengthening SSA capabilities and make sure that we catch the symptoms, and not only for the non-intentional issues, including debris, but also the political intentional ones. And also the combination of measures is important. So don't try to recover the assets based on the same assets. We can use the other means, including the terrestrial means, as well as the foreign or defense. If it's the case for the defense assets, then we may use the civilian assets. The cross-domain cooperation is another issue, using the other means, including the terrestrial systems to compensate for the missions. And finally, the international cooperation. It should be the case. For example, Japan has experienced of the loss of the weather satellite at a certain period of time, and we had international cooperation with the United States. So the GOES 15 has provided the weather information for Japan. So that was the sort of used as a model case for the international cooperation. The mission assurance architecture has to be based on the 3 points. One is to improve the resilience of the space systems. First, you need to strengthen and hardening the protection of the satellite itself, but also the dispersion, which means that not to try to use one satellite, but to try to use the constellation to mitigate the risks. Diversification is not to use the one system, but to use the multiple system. And the multiplication is that try to make a backups as much as possible. It doesn't have to be the Japan paying everything. It can be done between the civilian and private and defense entities, and also the international partners. Mitigation risks is of course important. So make sure that we send an alert, try to avoid all the possible collisions, and possibly if it's the case for the intentional attacks, we need to send an alert of the satellite operators for make sure that they have the means to protect their assets. And of course, the avoidance is to have those to be prepared for those operators to avoid those assets. So to include those means to make sure that you be prepared for those cases. And the final stage is if there is a loss of the satellite capacity and the space capabilities, then the reconstruction is an important part. One is the recovery. So a case like an ORS case, the operational responsible space, we can develop the small launch, immediate and readiness launch system for the small satellite, and also the substitution, which is to use the foreign or the private assets. So finally, the report issued a recommendation saying that it is important to share the information among the different agencies, including the JAXA, which is doing an SSA, and also the Ministry of Defense, which also has a capability of the SSA, but also sharing information with United States. And this sort of coordination and cooperation is at the extreme importance. And also, we need to assess our vulnerability. What is the most important space systems? What can we do if we lose one system, and then do we have the backup system? Do we have the recovery system? So we need to assess all the possibilities and assess the potential socio-economic impacts. And improve SSA capabilities, we are doing that, and improve the reconstruction capabilities, which I described to develop the small launching capabilities, small sat capabilities, and also we are now conducting a tabletop exercise, not like the one that we did 2 days ago, but it was it will be the tabletop exercise of the case of the business continuity plans. So if once the satellite system is lost, then what other people will do. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and private entities, operators. These are the design of tabletop exercise to mitigate the risks and mitigate the damages and try to avoid the risks. And also, we are now developing the series of international negotiation for the case of the loss of the services to make sure that, that we do have an agreement with other countries for and a mutual supporting system in case of a loss of services. And finally, we need to develop our industrial capabilities to meet the demand for the recovery and reconstitution of the space system. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
And let's see, next, going down the line, we have Commodore Nishant Kumar, who will be speaking.
At the outset, I would like to thank ORF for organizing the 4th ORF Kalpana Chawla Annual Policy Dialogue. The event assumes greater importance as in June this year, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first United Nations Conference on the exploration and peaceful uses of outer space by means of UniSpace Plus 50 event. The world is increasing dependency on space systems warrants uninterrupted services and protection of space assets from varied threats, both space-based, natural and intentional, space debris, placement of weapons in outer space, adverse effects of space weather, as well as ground-based threats, ASAT tests, direct energy weapons, missile attacks, and cyber threats. The previous speakers have made my job easy. As we see, there are 3 legs of space stability and sustainability: space debris, space situational awareness, and space weather. I'll be focusing in my presentation in the allocated time on these 3 aspects with India's approach. And finally, I will come to the conclusion that collaborative mechanism is the way forward. The unsustainable growth of space debris is posing a major threat to the sustainability of outer space activities for peaceful purposes. This is a computer-generated diagram which shows the menace of space debris. Coming to India's contribution, India has actively participated and contributed as a member of Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. We have implemented space debris mitigation guidelines in all missions. Other measures include venting of excess fuel and stage passivation for upper stages. Dr. Suresh highlighted the upper stage part, as well as satellite separation sequence for collision-free separation. Collision avoidance, that is COLA assessments, and studies on long-term evaluation and stability of space debris have also been taken. Coming to space situational awareness, the Space Objects Proximity Analysis, SOPA, is being done since 2009. Tracking is being done through the Multi-Object Tracking Radar Facility, which tracks 10 objects at a time with a slant range of 1,000 kilometers above Earth. Coming to space weather, a regional space weather warning center is operating at the National Physical Laboratory and is part of the International Space Environment Services chain. The Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research is working on space weather conditions such as coronal mass ejection dynamics and its interaction with solar winds. India is also undertaking the Aditya L1 mission, which aims to place a solar observatory to allow uninterrupted views of the sun. The emphasis of the Indian space program has always been on integrating the advances in space technology and appliances with the national development goals. ISRO is currently working with 60 ministries and departments of Government of India on promoting space technology tools and applications for good governance and national development. Coming to bilateral cooperation, this is the spread of bilateral cooperation. India joined the Hague Code of Conduct and MTCR in 2016. India places importance on international cooperation for peaceful uses of outer space. Currently, formal instruments of cooperation are in place with more than 40 countries and 4 international organizations. In the process, we have concluded more than 200 agreements, and some of the agreements have taken the shape of collaborative projects also. The shining example is the NISAR project, NASA-ISRO Synthetic Aperture Radar project. ISRO continues to share its facilities and expertise in the application of space science and technology through the United Nations affiliated Center for Space Science and Technology Education in Asia Pacific at Dehradun. As of now, there are about 1,900 beneficiaries from 96 countries. In the morning, it was highlighted that India should take a leading role in providing capacity building of ASEAN countries. So in the entire region, Asia Pacific region as such, there is a leading role from the India. We believe that outer space should be an ever-expanding frontier of cooperative endeavor rather than an area of conflict and contestation. This places a responsibility on all spacefaring nations to contribute to international efforts to safeguard outer space as the common heritage of humankind and preserve and promote the benefits flowing from advances made in space technology and its application for all. As a major spacefaring nation with wide-ranging interest in outer space activities, we remain opposed to the weaponization of outer space, and we support collective efforts to strengthen the safety and security of space-based assets. Towards this end, India is party to all major international treaties relating to outer space, having ratified the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, and the Registration Convention, and being signatory to the Moon Agreement. We believe that this international legal framework needs to be strengthened to enhance security of space assets for all space users and to prevent the weaponization of outer space. Yesterday evening, we talked about the Space Activities Law. The effort has been made that all our responsibilities that we have agreed to by means of these treaties and conventions are reflected in our draft bill which have been placed on the net. And there are issues like Liability Convention, where it is very, very clear that the launching country becomes responsible for any damage which is caused. So these are the issues which have to be well addressed. Coming to various multilateral initiatives, endeavors. First, of course, UN Corpus. India actively participates in the discussions on long-term sustainability of outer space activities at UN Corpus. While some differences remain among member states, we hope that a complete set of guidelines will be adopted prior to UniSpace Plus 50 event, thereby contributing to the enhancement of confidence building and fostering the sustainable use of outer space. The second, PAROS, that is Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space. India supports the substantive consideration of the issue of PAROS in the CD, Conference on Disarmament, whose membership includes all major spacefaring nations and where it has been on agenda since 1982, including inter alia negotiations in a subsidiary body as part of the program of work as called by UNGA Resolution 69 of 31, which India has traditionally co-sponsored. There's a bit of development in this. Now there's a government group of experts which is being constituted for the PAROS, and we have supported this move. But our preferred option would have been discussions in the Conference on Disarmament. Coming to another initiative, that is International Code of Conduct. India has actively participated in the consultations called by the EU since 2012 to discuss a draft code of conduct for outer space activities. We believe that code of conduct should be of voluntary, non-legally binding nature. It should be non-discriminatory and internationally acceptable. Then there's another initiative, that is prevention of placement of weapons in outer space. India is prepared to give consideration to the revised PPWT, which has been presented by Russia and China in CD, as a contribution to the various proposals for negotiating a legally binding instrument in the Conference of Disarmament. There are important gaps in the draft text in the present format, raising questions as to its utility in addressing current and emerging challenges, and there would be value in future in-depth examination of these issues. We would continue our support towards the adoption of guidelines on long-term sustainability of outer space activities in Vienna, as well as the adoption of a mandate on PAROS in the CD in Geneva, so that all proposals, including the draft PPWT and the EU Code of Conduct, could be taken up for discussion. Further, the third leg in New York, UNDC First Committee, could continue to be used for building mutual confidence and raising awareness. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Daniel Porras.
I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. First and foremost, let me please thank the organizers, in particular Raji, from where she went, for all their hard work. UNIDIR has been a supporter of this event in the past, and I've been participating since the beginning because of the valuable contribution that it makes to the overall dialogue on space activities. I'm always impressed with the range of views presented here, thanks in large part to the diversity of panels. And whilst I see a great deal of geographical diversity on this particular panel, I would also hope that we will continue to see a greater presence of women on future panels. Moving on. Anyone watching the news lately would have good cause for concern that the world is heading towards open conflict. The balance of powers that existed among states since the end of the Cold War is changing dramatically, with new actors on the rise and traditional alliances shifting. For many, it seems that the world is getting ready for a showdown at the OK Corral. There are few places where this is more evident than in outer space. While new technologies and improved capabilities are opening the door to an exciting new frontier, they are also creating a great deal of hand-wringing among governments and armed forces. Many would say that it has always been inevitable that conflict should finally migrate into zero-gravity zones, but we are still grappling with the implications of a breakdown in strategic stability in outer space. In particular, we have seen a sharp increase in the recent development of counter-space measures. Even more worrying, some of these measures consist of kinetic anti-satellite technology, a category of weapons which, as we've been hearing today, have catastrophic consequences for all human activities in our Earth's most valuable orbits. To this end, UNIDIR is currently carrying out a series of studies to be presented in several reports entitled the Space Dossier, in order to identify focused, meaningful steps that could be taken to ensure stability and sustainability in outer space. The first of these papers, which ORF has kindly printed out, and which was authored by my colleague, Mr. Joseph Rogers, focuses specifically on strategic stability in outer space. As many of you will already know, strategic stability is a balance of tensions that results when one actor resists destroying his or her adversaries because he or she cannot be sure that the first strike will be totally successful, leaving them vulnerable to a responding strike of equal or greater force. Now, as many of you may have noticed, I'm a fan of Western films, and as many of you know, any of you that have ever seen such films as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly or Tombstone would know that such a situation like this is often referred to, and to use an antiquated term, a Mexican standoff. And as you will also know, that as soon as the first gunfighter pulls his gun, a chaotic gunfight breaks out, and any townspeople had best run for cover. In the case of nuclear weapons, our intrepid gunfighters have been reluctant to be the first to pull the trigger precisely because of the incredibly destructive nature of the weapons. However, this is not necessarily the case when it comes to strategic stability in outer space. Strategic stability in space has largely been formed because of the role that space assets play in both nuclear and conventional conflict. Even in the earliest days of space activities, the US and USSR both recognized the value of spy satellites in verifying each other's activities, particularly those related to nuclear arms. Today, space assets play a critical role for every major military power. Telecommunications, Earth observation, guidance, and early warning systems are all made possible by the high ground available in outer space. Military adversaries have been reluctant to strike these critical components for fear of the escalation that might result. For example, a strike on a single US satellite that provides intelligence over the South China Sea could be interpreted as a sign that China means to move against Taiwan. Now, this may not be the case, and it may not even be China that disabled the satellite, but the reactions on the ground could still be extremely grave. For this reason, superpowers that hold counter-space capabilities have largely, not always, but largely, been reluctant to utilize this technology against anyone else. What's more, in the case of kinetic ASAT missiles, a physical strike on a space asset can create huge amounts of space debris that then becomes an indiscriminate threat to all actors in space, including those of the attacker. The most notorious example, of course, and we've been saying it all day, is the cloud of debris that was left over from the 2007 Chinese ASAT test. It is for this reason that many are becoming increasingly concerned with the activities of the space powers in recent years, months, and even weeks, even days. In no particular order, I was going to go through some of the examples of how counterspace capabilities are being developed, but Victoria has already taken care of that so exquisitely that I'll just say this. The development of counterspace technology is not being done in a vacuum. There are other things that increase tensions that could also lead to conflict in space, such as the United States' recent nuclear posture review, which has certainly ramped up tensions in the CD and with Russia and China. It is in this context that UNIDIR is presently carrying out the study on the development of ASAT test norms. Whilst it is probably wishful thinking that the US, Russia, and China would suddenly reach an agreement to ban all ASAT weapons, there has been a shift in attitudes that might prevail over security tensions. This shift in attitude can be seen, for example, in the Secretary of Defense General Mattis's recent comments, in which he clearly stated that we'll come up with arms control agreements at some point, and we'll start getting this under control. The reason for this is most likely an economic one. Simply stated, the levels of investment by both governments and private actors in space are reaching astronomical heights. No? Okay. As the space economy grows and the superpowers become increasingly dependent on space assets, there is less and less appetite for destruction in space, particularly for the debris left over from ASATs. One just has to look at China's conduct since the 2007 test, which they have continued to carry out tests that do not create debris, as well as the public outcry, to see that there is a general consensus around the world that tests should not create debris. I am, therefore, proposing the following 3 guidelines for the conduct of ASAT tests: no debris, low debris, notification. If a party wishes to test ASAT technology, it should not create debris. If they must create debris, the test should be done at an altitude low enough that the debris will re-enter the atmosphere in a short period. And finally, actors carrying out the test should notify the world, someone, the UN, that this test will occur in order to prevent any misperceptions of an attack. These guidelines could certainly serve as a transparency and confidence building measure, as was proposed by the group of governmental experts in 2013 on TCBMs. Now, this proposal is by no means refined. In fact, I look forward to discussing the form and presentation of this proposal with all of you. How should it be drafted? How detailed should it be? Under what body should such guidelines be proposed? These are all questions that need to be answered, but what remains absolutely clear is the need for such standards of practice in order to avoid an increase in debris. I recognize, of course, that this is a very small proposal for a very large issue. I am neither calling for the banning or limiting of counterspace measures in times of war. The CD and Porras have certainly shown the folly of that hope. These guidelines would simply address the testing of ASAT technology and the proliferation of space debris. But while this step is small, concentrated one, it would be the first time in a very, very long time that the international community moved forward on arms control in outer space. Such a victory could lead to greater stability and sustainability, both in the heavens and here on Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we have our last speaker, Marco Aliberti.
Thank you very much. So it is a great honor to be once again here at this annual Space Policy Dialogue and to appear in such distinguished panel. And I thanks once again all the organizers for inviting me. Okay, what I would like to do in this brief presentation is to elaborate a bit on what I think is a fundamental issue affecting current international initiatives dealing with stability and sustainability. The identification of this issue, in my view, can also shed some lights on the tools we would need to fully promote these objectives. So one of the key recommendations, okay, sorry, I didn't see it. One of the key recommendations we always hear when we talk about like stability and sustainability is the need to strengthen international efforts aimed at developing norms of responsible and sustainable space behavior. Fair enough, this is certainly true. We also have to recognize, though, that we have plenty of initiatives intended to promote stability and sustainability of outer space. Some have been successfully agreed, like the debris mitigation guidelines, for instance. Some have been killed, like the EU Code of Conduct, for instance. And some are still in progress. And many new will for sure come, for instance, like we just heard about the ASAT norms. So over the past 2 weeks, for instance, we have had intense negotiations at the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of UN COPOS with the long-term sustainability guidelines. What's the point here? Why all these initiatives are certainly praiseworthy, and I will also explain why. My baseline assessment is that there is a fundamental flaw here, as all these initiatives, both soft law or hard law or legal instruments, lack clear and effective mechanism for verification, adjudication, and enforcement. Why is that necessary, after all? Much of the current space regime is based on principles, norms, and rules upon which states' expectations have been converging over the past 50 years, but not enforcement mechanisms. Well, when the space regime was elaborated, strategic interaction in space was extremely limited, and most of space issues were characterized by situational harmony of interest. So it's a situation where everybody can do as it pleases without affecting the interests of others. Where restrictions have been accepted by states, these have not to date imposed much constraints upon the actors. For instance, the denial of sovereignty claims or the bans on placing weapons of mass destruction in space have been thus far costless concessions given the present state of technology. For many activities related to space, individual states can basically do what they want without affecting the others. There are situations where individual decision-making could lead to collective suboptimalities. And in this case, relatively simple coordination regimes have been established to ensure stability. But once defined, the point is that once defined, those agreements, the agreed upon rules were self-enforcing. Think, for instance, the ITU regime for managing the allocation of the radio spectrum. Now, this situation is changing rapidly nowadays because, as we have heard, like yesterday and today, we have many, many new actors, like with ambitious undertakings. Things, for instance, the mega constellation projects. We have many new enabling technologies and also like new uses of space. Things, for instance, rendezvous and proximity operations. We have also an increased, not to say critical, dependence on space assets, which was not the case before. And most importantly, we have a new political context, which is like the most important thing in my view, characterized by power-like transitions and what like Richard Haas was calling like the unraveling of the post-Cold War order. Now, the fact that we have new actors or new capability does not per se like put strains on stability or sustainability, but however, in my view, is changing the general configuration of interest, creating a clear progression toward, let's say, cooperation problems, or what like our scholar would term as situation of dilemma of common interest, situation that is which may be conducive to instability or like tragedy of the common scenarios. And why is that? Because unlike coordination problems, for this kind of situation, even when you have agreed upon rules, we always run the risk that some actors like will defect, because it is in their interest to do so. This is visible in many issue areas. For instance, the debris mitigation offers like one clear example, and so possibly does also the weaponization problems. For all these kind of problems, cooperation based on voluntary compliance is not enough. In order to have convergence of behavior among the actors, we would need not only well-defined rules that specify what is legal, what is responsible, what is sustainable, what vice versa constitute cheating, but also, and maybe most importantly, mechanism for monitoring behavior that make the function unaffordable. In the case, for instance, of the debris mitigation, it would be a debris tax, for instance. Therefore, in this kind of situation, we theoretically need a very elaborated regime. However, as all disarmament agreements, for instance, show, constructing regimes for solving cooperation problems is inherently more challenging and complex than it is for like coordination problem, because, as I said, like those rules are not self-enforcing. In fact, like the high level of institutionalization that is required like to build such regime, and also like the constraints they impose upon the parties make them highly unlikely in the current scenario, though desirable. A clear case in point here was, I think, was given by the outcome of the last Amos dialogue on the future of SSA. I took this from our moderator presentation, which is obviously relevant here, SSA being a foundational element for like both stability and sustainability. So as it emerged from the dialogue, there is a general recognition that the most desirable future scenario would be that of a globally governed system for providing SSA services. Yet there is also a clear recognition that this is the least realistic scenario, at least for the moment. The more realistic scenario is, of course, an extension of the current US-led system for the provision of SSA services. Although this is a, let's say, suboptimal provision of SSA-related services. So now the difficulty to build effective cooperation regimes does not necessarily mean that we have no means to start squaring the circle. There is, in fact, a number of functional steps that we could take both at national, regional, international level to help promote stability and sustainability. Among the things we can and should adopt and strive for is, first of all, to enact national space legislation and space policies that incorporate best practice, for instance, or like debris mitigation guidelines. Ideally, this policy should also make clear what national interests are and what the state consider as a responsible behavior and what not. We could also expand bilateral and multilateral cooperation in the form of policy dialogue and consultation intended to, at the very least, to increase mutual understanding among the actors. We can also like build, let's say, coalition, as we heard, and practical agreements among like-minded spacefaring nations on specific common issues that can be solved like through this agreement. And of course, like we can continue supporting like soft law and norms of behavior that could lead to an international consensus as a preliminary step for a future hard law instruments. Now, are those steps sufficient to ensure stability and sustainability? Certainly not. However, they're like still useful, important, and here like my constructivist, let's say, mindset comes to the fore, because for one thing, they help to reduce the risks of misperceptions and miscalculations, and by extension, the risks of conflict. And also because they help increasing understanding, they help in building trust, and they help orienting interest, eventually maybe shaping or informing actors' behaviors. This also explains why, in my view, states do pay a lot of attention to soft law instruments, even if they're not legally binding, and also explains why proactive, diplomatic engagement and talks at bilateral and multilateral level with like-minded partners is a necessary step to prevent misperception, for instance, as in the case of the code, about like, vested interest, which were not the case, or like to ensure consensus on norms that can regulate responsible behavior in outer space. And I conclude by saying that exactly this point about enhancing dialogue for mutual understanding and about like national interest is one of the key major points that I've raised in a recent books that I've just published on the future of Europe-India cooperation. And I really take the last 2 minutes of like this presentation, since this is a great venue, to make some promotion about this new book entitled Indian Space Between Utility and Geopolitics. I'm sorry for that. I think that's the best venue to do that. So like the overarching objective of this book is to reflect on India's unique place within the realm of the major spacefaring nations, and to disentangle from a wide range of perspective the country's evolving strategies and expanding rationales for engaging in space. Building on that, the book wants to elaborate on what the consequences and opportunities are for European stakeholders to foster closer and mutually beneficial space cooperation with this country, both at pan-European level and at national level. Of course, our reference stakeholders are European policymakers. To many of you, the book may not add many new elements, also considering that I see many of my mentors in this room. But however, it can provide like different perspective, and also responded, in my view, to the need of raising awareness among European policymakers and more broadly at the international level about the growing significance that this country is inevitably bound to play, both in space and here on Earth, and hence find ways to size this potential, the cooperation potential. As you can see from this minimal overview, the book puts a lot of attention on the progressive diversification of the Indian space program and tries to do so by embedding the country's space activities within the broader economic and political context, and hence by assessing the domestic, regional, and international factors influencing the pace and direction of the country's space activities. The book more specifically puts the spotlight on India's uses of space as a tool of its developmental and economic immersion strategy, as well as on the emerging use related to India's security and diplomatic objectives, both from space and in space. The study also provides an analysis of Indian path forward, including reflection on the long-term evolution of civil, military, and commercial space effort. And a central part of like this final analytical part is devoted to elaborating on the consequences and opportunities for all the European stakeholders, where, and in this part I also identify basically new domains for closer and win-win Europe-India cooperation. Cooperation that thus far has remained, unfortunately, really untapped. So I've brought like a few like flyers and a few copies like for the organizer, but please do not hesitate to contact me should you wish to have more information or to receive a copy of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. So I know we are digging into lunchtime, so maybe just 1 or 2 quick questions from the crowd. Thank you. Wait for the microphone, please.
I would like to ask Mr. Daniel Porras, that being ambiguous about the ASAT norms, and in contrast to being ambiguous and to saying that these are the norms and you should follow these if you are doing any ASAT tests, won't it be a kind of approval to some of the states? They will think that it's a kind of approval to ASAT tests, and this might lead to being in more danger, because China would not have certainly wanted to create that much debris. But in case that they are not able to satisfy the norms, what are the consequences? Shouldn't we focus more on how do we deal with the consequences if they don't comply to the norms?
So in response to that, I would say we've been dealing with that problem for something like 40 years, and the CD hasn't made any progress whatsoever. At the most recent session, the chairman came up with a spectacular proposal that might actually go forward, which is the establishing of several working groups to deal with some of the agenda items, including Porras. And yet the steps that are being taken there are also extremely minor. Now, I know that a number of countries will be concerned that the establishing of, or the actual writing down of certain norms would legitimize the weaponization of outer space. My response to that is simply, we're headed in that direction already. This is a preliminary step to try and avert some of the potential dangers that could result from the activities that are already being done. Now, I would argue that the norms are actually already more or less being established. China has continued to carry out mid-course ballistic tests, including some missiles that have gone into very high altitudes that can reach that can reach government satellites, spy satellites, but they've stopped creating debris. In that sense, and plus, given all the public outcry that followed, I think there really is a general consensus that these tests are going to happen, and if they are going to happen, it should be done in a responsible way. So yes, this is a very realpolitik approach to it, but I think it is a concentrated, focused approach that will actually result in something tangible. And I think that will actually build much further towards ensuring stability and sustainability in the near-term future, and give us sufficient time to perhaps come up with some further and more elaborate agreements. But for the time being, I see this as being a viable way forward, and forward is the operative word.
Right, and before we go on to our next question, I'd just actually like to ask the rest of the panel, do you guys have thoughts of this proposal?
I think it's an interesting proposal. Like my thoughts is whether like the proposal per se might risk to be counterproductive at the end of the day, and like open, let's say, a Pandora vase that can be intended as a green light to test ASATs, basically. And this is, I don't know if something that we want, basically, in my view. So that's actually my question, whether you thought that this could be intended as a green light to test, like, for actors that still live in this gray area, because there appears like to be consensus, at least, that, I mean, we should not test ASATs. So like this could be, no.
Basically, I think this is an excellent idea. Well, the ASAT test will take place no matter what, and it happens with or without this norm. And if it happens, then we need to regulate that. So I fully second Daniel's position. And also, I think to have that norm established means that if there is any other countries which are now engaging into an ASAT activities, then we need to say, hey, this is the rule. You have to follow the rule. And of course, I mean, in the long term, we may prefer to have the world without ASAT. But if you do, then you have to, you shall not create debris. You shall do it in the low Earth orbit, and you have to do it in a transparent way. And I think that is the more reasonable approach and realistic approach.
Commander?
All efforts and endeavors should be towards that outer space is not weaponized. In fact, we should make efforts that we should develop some kind of comprehensive legally binding instrument. That is a very big aim, which throws light on the rules of road, and that rules of road should be very clear that there should be no hint at all about weaponization of space. Yes, it is, the panelist highlighted that it is happening, but it's a very dangerous trend. It's a global common that must be used for the betterment of the humankind. Then we should go for the weaponization of space. So my recommendation would be that we should have some kind of collaborative mechanism, maybe comprehensive guidelines, legally binding instruments that should forbid any kind of weaponization of space.
And just my 2 cents as the power of the chairman added in. I think the United States, one of the concerns that typically I've heard U.S. government reps talk about a potential KEASAT ban is that it would interfere with U.S. missile defense testing. So I think it would have to be scripted very carefully so that that would not be interfered with, because as much as I don't like missile defense, unfortunately it's part of how our government does tend to function about national security. Paul, really quickly.
Yeah, no, to Commodore Kumar, I mean, you relayed the Indian attitudes towards a number of proposals that exist. I guess my question is, are there any ideas for space security or arms control that India would be, would want to consider deploying on its own?
As of now, there are, as I highlighted, there are a number of initiatives and endeavors. And as we intend participating in those in these initiatives only. There are no new proposals that we are mooting, because to our appreciation, there are both kinds of proposal on table. It is soft laws as well as hard laws, and we see that if we make an effort where all the concerns and entire proposal is evaluated in the entirety, there is a hope that we'll be able to develop comprehensive guidelines regarding outer space.
If I may just respond real quick. Again, Marco, I don't disagree that there is the possibility that this will further potentially encourage more ASAT testing. But again, I don't think that what is currently stopping ASAT testing is any type of moral imperative or international consensus. I think the only thing that's stopping a lot of parties from testing this type of equipment is simply the lack of technological capabilities. So when those capabilities become more diffused, as more and more people develop them, I think at best, if it's going to happen anyway, we should have some kind of agreement on how it can be done responsibly. Now, I'm also not ruling out the possibility of having eventually a legal instrument, potentially even a comprehensive legal instrument that would address all the space security concerns. However, as we have seen, the International Code of Conduct was not legally binding. It was comprehensive, and it was still impossible to get any progress going. There have been, the PPWT also has seen very little progress despite having been drafted twice. So in light of those roadblocks, I'm proposing this very small step as a first step towards those exact goals. But I do think that at the moment, practicality and reality must rule our judgment. And also to you, Victoria, as well. Part of the reason why I say no debris or low debris, also the way that this is crafted must also be done in such a way that it wouldn't impact testing of other things. Again, I'm not trying to stop people from developing their weapon systems. I'm just trying to keep them from creating more debris that will cause indiscriminate harm in space for all.
Okay, I think we had a question in the middle. Can we get our microphone over there?
Hello. Okay, so I have a twofold quick question. One is that can polluter pays principle be equivalently applicable to something to do with space debris? And the second is, do states ably compensate for any space debris destructions or problems that might occur? I would take the cue from the one example that I know, that when one of the, a debris from an Indian satellite fell into one of the Japanese villages, was India able to compensate it properly, given that though both the countries have ratified it, but India does not even have a proper state act to say how much you would compensate for it? Thank you.
So I'll take a quick stab at the second part of the question. Under the Liability Convention, there is absolute liability for any damage caused on Earth from space assets. In space, you have fault-based liability. And so I don't think we've ever had to invoke the Liability Convention. Usually everything gets settled by out of court. There have been a number of examples where countries have negotiated with each other for certain levels of compensation. But certainly, if there are damages, there are already legal systems put in place to take care of that. And referring to the pollution aspect, there are already a number of treaties that deal with environmental issues in outer space. But at the moment, I don't believe that there is anything that specifically prohibits the creation of debris in space, namely because people have to launch things, sometimes satellites run out of gas, and they could potentially, any companies or governments that are engaging in those activities would run afoul of those types of treaties. And so I don't think that we've reached the point yet where they apply to space.
Well, in addition to that, it's really hard to identify who is responsible for what. I mean, the satellite can malfunction and stop working, but whether it's because of the debris or whether it's because of something else, we don't know. I mean, there are some occasional cases that you have the large satellite hitting another satellite, and this is the case in 2009 that the Russian dead satellite is colliding with Iridium satellite, but the Iridium has not brought that into a court, and they just settled outside. I mean, they used the insurance. So basically, there is no established legal framework to put the responsibility for the polluters.
India and Japan have a very deep space relations. Even that translates to institution, that is JAXA and ISRO. And these issues are sorted out to mutual satisfaction to both the parties.
And really quickly, just the most amount of mass on orbit is actually spent Russian rocket stages. Where are the Russians in this discussion? They don't want to pay for it. All right, we have two more quick questions. I think we're about to go to lunch, so Chandrasekhar?
I just wanted to add a little bit. There was this Cosmos 954 satellite, which carried a nuclear reactor, and it malfunctioned and it crash landed into Canada. This happened when I used to attend the Outer Space Committee meetings. So it was brought up in the committee, and it was looked at, and it went through a fairly horrendous and, shall we say, a fairly militant discussion, one would argue. But it finally got settled out of court. Okay. So my point is, yeah, it can happen, and it is an issue of concern, but most of the things so far have been settled between countries that are involved. Yeah.
Okay, just a comment. You may choose to respond if you, again, what I brought out in my presentation when I started off, most of the discussion generally tends to highlight or gets hijacked towards the kinetic and the destructive elements. But I think, you have overshadowed, actually what's going to happen is the non-kinetic is going to really dominate the space sustainability efforts. And that actually, tends to get overshadowed, and I think we need to really put in more effort in terms of the weapon, the co-orbital capabilities, the lasing, the optical systems, and those issues, and of course the radio frequency interference or jamming as such.
No, I'm in total agreement on that particular point. And in fact, one of the reasons why I have selected kinetic ASAT testing is specifically because this should be a slam dunk. The governments who have the most to lose from being in space, I think, will see hopefully the reasonableness of this very, very small proposal. Again, the CD hasn't been able to make any strides in something like 40 years. So what I'm proposing is a baby step. I mean, it's like somebody coming out of a coma. You have to take very, very small steps. But that could also build trust. It builds comedy between partners and potentially could lead to greater discussions on transparency and confidence building measures in the future, perhaps even a legal instrument at some point. But right now, I'm just trying to find something that is very simple to do.
So yeah, I wanted to add also as well. I mean, in fact, LTS, the long-term sustainability guidelines, try to cover aspects such as rendezvous and proximity operation, as well as like the utilization of source of lasers, and those in fact are like the most contentious guidelines, which have still didn't find consensus at COPUS.
I think this conversation going on longer. I'm sorry, but I've been given the hook from Raji. So please join me in thanking this panel for a lively discussion, and hopefully we can continue over lunch.